Hey guys, tonight we are drifting back 500 years to one of history's most dramatic and heartbreaking collisions of civilizations, a moment when one man's hesitation, born perhaps from religious uncertainty, political calculation, or simply the impossible weight of the unknown, may have sealed the fate of millions. And honestly, if you were standing in Moctezuma's sandals on that fateful morning in 1519, watching reports trickle in about floating mountains carrying pale strangers with thundersticks and metal skin, you probably would have made some questionable decisions too, because let me tell you, nothing in the Aztec political handbook covered what to do when potential gods show up demanding to meet your emperor, and they smell absolutely terrible. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a breath that fills your whole chest, and know that tonight we're going to wander through jade-green markets and blood-stained temple steps, through whispered omens and catastrophic misunderstandings, through one of history's great what-ifs. And you probably won't survive this story emotionally intact because it's genuinely one of the most tragic tales humanity has ever produced. But at least you'll fall asleep knowing something profound about the fragility of empires and the chaos of first contact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the edge of the Great Lake, and the year is somewhere around 1500, give or take a decade. And the first thing that hits you isn't a sight but a smell, the mingled scent of wood smoke and roasting maize, the faint copper tang of blood from the distant temples, the marshy richness of Lake Texcoco's brackish waters, and underneath it all, something floral, because the Aztecs, despite what Spanish chroniclers would later emphasize about the whole human sacrifice situation, were absolutely obsessed with flowers, maintaining elaborate floating gardens called chinampas, that produced not just food but blossoms of every conceivable color, and if you close your eyes and let your imagination drift, you can almost feel the humidity on your skin, that particular tropical highland moisture that sits at about 7,000 feet above sea level, where the air is thin enough to make newcomers dizzy, but the locals move with practiced ease. The city rising before you, Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec world, is genuinely one of the engineering marvels of human history, and I'm not being hyperbolic here, because when the Spanish conquistadors first saw it, hardened soldiers who had fought across the Caribbean and seen wonders of their own actually compared it to an enchanted vision from a romance novel, with its white plastered buildings gleaming in the mountain sunshine, its causeways stretching across the lake like ribbons connecting an island metropolis to the mainland, its aqueducts carrying fresh water from Chapultepec Springs, its markets that drew traders from hundreds of miles in every direction. You walk slowly along one of those causeways now, feeling the smooth stone beneath your feet, and the causeway is wide enough for 8 men to walk abreast, which is impressive until you realize it also has removable wooden bridges at regular intervals, defensive choke points that can transform a welcoming road into a death trap. And this is your first hint that the Aztecs, for all their flower gardens and poetry contests, were very serious about warfare, and very good at it. The mainstream historical fact that grounds our story tonight is this. At its height around 1519, Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the entire world, with a population estimated between 200,000 and 300,000 people, making it larger than any city in Spain, larger than London or Paris, a genuine urban giant whose sophisticated infrastructure, sanitation systems, and organized markets would have impressed visitors from any contemporary civilization. But here's a quirky fringe tidbit that often gets overlooked. The Aztecs had a complex system of public latrines, particularly in the marketplace areas, and they collected human waste for use in tanning leather and as agricultural fertilizer, which means they had a more organized approach to sanitation than most European cities of the same era, where the standard practice was essentially dump it in the street and hope for rain. And honestly, this small detail tells you something important about the sophistication we're dealing with here. A civilization that thought systematically about urban planning and public health, while also, cutting out hearts on pyramids. Because human cultures are complicated and contradictory, and never quite fit into simple categories. You let yourself drift deeper into the city now, past the outer residential districts where ordinary craftsmen and farmers live in modest adobe homes with small courtyard gardens, past the workshops where obsidian is napped into surgical sharp blades and featherworkers create mosaics of such intricate beauty that Spanish priests would later send them to Europe as curiosities, past the schools called Karmakak, where noble children memorize poetry and astronomical tables and the proper forms of ritual speech, and the sound around you is a constant low hum of activity, voices bargaining, children playing, the rhythmic thump of women grinding maize on stone metates, the occasional cry of a turkey from someone's backyard, and over it all, at regular intervals, the deep reverberating boom of drums from the temple district. Because time in Tenochtitlan is measured not by church bells, but by these massive instruments made from hollowed logs and stretched jaguar skin, and they can be heard for miles, marking the hours and the ceremonies and the moments when the gods receive their offerings. Some scholars debate whether the Aztec Empire was a true empire in the administrative sense, or more of a hegemonic tribute system, and this open scholarly debate actually matters for understanding what happens later, because the Aztecs didn't generally occupy conquered territories with standing armies or install their own governors. Instead, they defeated enemies, extracted promises of tribute, and left local rulers in place as long as the goods kept flowing, which made for an efficient extraction system, but also meant that many subject peoples harbored deep resentment and would eagerly ally with anyone who promised to break Aztec power. You find yourself in the great marketplace of Tlatelolco now, and this is genuinely overwhelming, even for someone who has seen modern shopping malls, because the Spanish soldier Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was actually there and wrote a memoir about it decades later, claimed that 60,000 people visited this market on major trading days, and while that number might be inflated by aging memory, even a fraction of that would make it one of the busiest commercial centers on Earth. The organization is surprisingly modern, different sections for different goods, judges wandering the aisles to settle disputes and check for cheating, standardized measures, currency in the form of cacao beans and cotton cloaks, and a dizzying variety of merchandise. Here are the gold and silver sellers with their delicate jewelry. There are the feather merchants with bundles of Quetzal plumes worth more than jade. Beyond them, the potters and basket weavers, the vendors of medicinal herbs, who know remedies for ailments. The Spanish haven't even identified yet. The slave dealers. Yes, slavery existed here, though it was different from what would come later, often temporary, and with legal protections. The mat sellers, the paper makers, the sellers of copal incense, and rubber balls, and obsidian mirrors, and live animals for food or sacrifice. You buy a cup of frothy chocolate from a vendor, because chocolate is an Aztec invention, and they drink it spiced with chili and vanilla, and the taste is strange on your tongue, bitter and rich, and somehow perfect for this warm afternoon. And you think about how this beverage will eventually conquer the world, but Europeans will add sugar and call it their own, which is really a metaphor for a lot of what's about to happen. The humor in this situation, if you can call it that, is that the Aztecs had a word for people who talked too much in the marketplace. They called them owners of tired tongues, and if that's not the most relatable ancient concept you've heard all week, I don't know what to tell you. You drift toward the ceremonial center now, and the architecture shifts around you, becoming grander and more intimidating. The buildings decorated with carved serpents and jaguars and stylized skulls, the paint still bright in reds and blues and yellows that will fade within a century to the bare stone we see in museum reconstructions today. The Great Pyramid, the Templo Mayor, rises before you like a man-made mountain, twin staircases climbing its face to twin temples at the summit, one dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god, painted blue, and one to Huitzilopochtli, the war god and sun deity, painted red, and the symbolism is as blunt as the architecture. Water and war, agriculture and combat, the two pillars on which Aztec civilization rests. The steps are steep, maybe 70 degrees, and climbing them was probably a cardiovascular nightmare, even for people acclimated to the altitude, and victims being led to sacrifice sometimes had to be supported by priests, though whether from terror or simple exhaustion, the sources don't specify. Let's address the sacrifice thing directly, because it's impossible to talk about Aztec civilization without it. And yes, human sacrifice was real and extensive and involved the ritual killing of thousands of people annually, mostly war captives but also slaves and occasionally volunteers, and the hearts were cut from living chests with obsidian knives and offered to the sun, and the bodies were tumbled down the pyramid steps. And this is genuinely horrifying from a modern perspective, and was genuinely horrifying from a Spanish Catholic perspective too, even though the Spanish weren't exactly strangers to torture and execution themselves. And some scholars argue about the exact numbers involved. The famous claim that 80,000 people were sacrificed at the dedication of the Templo Mayor's reconstruction in 1487 is almost certainly exaggerated, but even revised estimates in the thousands represent an industrial scale of ritual killing that's hard to contextualize. The Aztec understanding was that the universe ran on sacrifice, that the gods had given their own blood to create humanity, and that humans owed a debt that could only be repaid in kind, and the sun itself would stop moving across the sky without regular infusions of human vitality. And from inside this worldview, sacrifice wasn't cruelty, but cosmic maintenance, the highest possible service to the continuation of existence itself. And I'm not asking you to approve of this or feel comfortable with it, just to understand that people believed it sincerely and structured their entire society around it, which is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. You climb the pyramid now, your thighs burning, your breath coming short in the thin air, and the view from the top is genuinely spectacular, the entire Valley of Mexico spread before you like a map, the lake glittering, the distant snow-capped volcanoes, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, rising against the sky, and on a clear day you can see for 50 miles in every direction, which meant that any approaching army would be visible long before it arrived, that Tenochtitlan had early warning built into its geography, that the Aztecs felt secure in their island fortress surrounded by water and protected by gods who demanded blood and delivered victories. This is where we need to talk about Moctezuma T, who by 1502 had become the Tlatoani, the one who speaks, the supreme ruler of this extraordinary polity, and Moctezuma, sometimes spelled Montezuma, and scholars bicker about this too, because the original Nahuatl used sounds that don't map cleanly onto European alphabets, was not a simple man, and not an incompetent one, despite what later portrayals might suggest. He was a warrior who had proven himself in combat, a priest who had served in the temples before taking power, a political operator who had navigated the treacherous waters of Aztec court intrigue, and by all accounts he was intelligent, dignified, somewhat austere in his personal habits, fond of philosophical conversation, interested in natural history and the diversity of the world, maintaining gardens of unusual plants and collections of rare animals, essentially a Renaissance man in a culture that had no contact with the European Renaissance. His household was famously elaborate, with rules about who could look directly at him, what dishes he could eat from, how many concubines attended to his needs. Some sources say he had 3,000 servants, and this luxurious isolation may have contributed to his fatal hesitation when crisis arrived, because Moctezuma, for all his power, was not accustomed to making quick decisions under pressure. He was accustomed to receiving information through intermediaries and responding through ritual and protocol, and the situation that was about to develop would not wait for protocol. The years before 1519 were troubled ones for the Aztec world, and here's where we get into the famous omens, those portentous signs that later sources, both indigenous and Spanish, claimed foreshadowed the coming catastrophe. A comet streaked across the sky, or perhaps it was a volcanic eruption seen from a distance, or perhaps it was added to the story later to make the narrative more dramatic, because we should be honest that many of our sources for Aztec history were written after the conquest, often by people who had reasons to emphasize that the end was cosmically predetermined. The lake supposedly boiled without cause, flooding the city. A temple caught fire and burned despite efforts to extinguish it with water. A woman's voice was heard weeping through the streets at night, crying, "My children, we are lost." And this may be an early version of the La Llorona legend that still haunts Mexican folklore. Moctezuma reportedly consulted his priests and astrologers obsessively during this period, seeking to understand what the signs meant, and some sources suggest he became genuinely fearful, even depressed, though again we should note that these accounts were compiled years later by people who knew how the story ended, and may have projected backwards. The quirky historical tidbit here is that Moctezuma maintained a kind of zoo, called a totocoli, that housed not just exotic animals, but also humans with unusual physical characteristics, people with dwarfism, albinism, or other conditions, who were fed and cared for as objects of curiosity and perhaps religious significance. And while this sounds grotesque to modern ears, it was actually more humane than how many European courts of the same era treated such individuals, and it speaks to that collector's mentality, that desire to possess and understand the full range of natural variety that characterized Moctezuma's intellectual personality. You descend the pyramid as the sun begins to set, and the city transforms around you, torches and braziers flickering to life, the smell of cooking fires rising from 100,000 homes, and there's something almost impossibly poignant about this moment. Knowing what you know about what's coming, standing in a place that will soon be razed to its foundations, walking among people whose world is about to end in ways they cannot imagine. The Aztecs had a concept called tonali, a kind of soul heat or life force that animated living beings, and could be strengthened or depleted by various activities, and they believed that certain days and certain moments carried more or less tonality, that time itself was not uniform, but had a texture, some periods being auspicious and others dangerous, and you find yourself wondering what quality of time this is, this peaceful evening in the last years of an empire, whether the cosmos knew what was gathering itself beyond the horizon. You hear the drums again, measuring out the hours until midnight, and somewhere in the temple district, priests are preparing for nocturnal ceremonies, bloodletting rituals where they would pierce their own tongues and earlobes and genitals with maggy spines, collecting the blood on paper strips to be burned as offerings, because the demand for sacrifice extended to everyone, not just captives, and the elite were expected to give their own vitality alongside that of victims, which doesn't make the larger system more ethical, but does make it more coherent. A shared burden rather than simply exploitation. You find a quiet corner near one of the smaller canals, and you watch the water reflect the stars, and the gentle lapping sound is probably the most peaceful thing in this entire narrative so far, because once the ships arrive, there won't be much peace for anyone. The mainstream historical fact we should emphasize again is this: the Aztec state in 1519 was not declining or weakening, it was at or near the peak of its power, expanding its influence, collecting tribute from an area larger than modern Germany, and no external enemy had ever seriously threatened Tenochtitlan itself. The geography was simply too favorable, an island fortress in a lake surrounded by causeways that could be cut at strategic points. The disaster that was coming would not result from Aztec military weakness, but from a perfect storm of factors: disease, political fragmentation, technological surprise, and above all, a series of decisions that in retrospect seem almost inexplicable, but which made a certain kind of terrible sense in the moment. Moctezuma could not have known that the strangers approaching his coast carried invisible plagues that would kill more of his people than any weapon. He could not have known that his tributary enemies would welcome the invaders as liberators. He could not have known that the Spanish legal fiction of reading a document in Latin to people who didn't speak Latin would be used to justify the theft of an entire continent. He knew only that something unprecedented was happening, that his systems for understanding the world were failing him, that the gods seemed silent or confusing, and in that uncertainty he would make choices that history would judge harshly, though perhaps no human could have done better facing the absolute unknown. The night deepens around you now, and the city sleeps, mostly though somewhere children are being born, and elders are dying, and young warriors are dreaming of the glory they'll win in the flowery wars, those ritualized conflicts designed to capture prisoners rather than kill enemies, and none of them know that within 20 years, their entire civilization will be a memory, their temples demolished, their books burned, their gods forbidden, their descendants baptized into a faith they never chose. Sleep is creeping up on you now, and you let it come, because tomorrow we have to watch the ships arrive, and that's going to require all the emotional energy you can muster. So rest now, let the drums fade into the background, let the smell of the lake and the flowers become a gentle cocoon, and know that understanding tragedy is not the same as accepting it, that mourning the past is not futile, that somewhere in this story there are lessons about hubris and humility and the terrifying contingency of history, and you'll have time to find them. But not tonight, not yet, not yet. Just breathe, and let the first section close around you like dark water closing over a stone. You wake to the sound of waves, which is disorienting because you fell asleep in an island city on a lake. But now you're standing on a Caribbean beach somewhere along the coast of what will eventually be called Mexico, and the year has shifted to 1517, 2 years before the main drama, because to understand the fatal mistake, you need to understand the slow building process that preceded it, the scouting expeditions and initial contacts and gathering intelligence that shaped how both sides would interpret the climactic encounter. The sand beneath your feet is warm, almost hot, and the jungle pressing against the beach is loud with bird calls and monkey chatter, and the soaring of insects, and the humidity is brutal compared to the highlands you visited last night, the kind of wet heat that makes you feel like you're breathing through a warm washcloth, and somewhere out on that impossibly blue water, there are Spanish ships doing what Spanish ships did in this era, which was poking around the edges of the known world, looking for anything worth stealing. The first expedition to touch Mexican shores was led by Francisco Hernández de Córdoba in 1517, and it did not go well for the Spanish, who landed near Campeche and encountered Maya warriors, who were significantly better organized and more numerous than the Caribbean peoples. The Spanish had been brutalizing for the past 25 years, and the Maya handed Hernández de Córdoba such a thorough defeat that he limped back to Cuba with half his men dead or wounded, and himself mortally injured, which should probably have been a warning about what lay ahead. But here's the thing about conquistadors. They were not deterred by warnings, and honestly, the job description kind of required a willingness to ignore obvious signs that you should turn around and go home. Because the entire enterprise of showing up in unfamiliar places with small numbers of men and demanding that everyone give you their stuff only works if you're pathologically confident. The governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, organized a second expedition in 1518 under his nephew, Juan de Grijalva, and this one actually sailed along the Gulf Coast, spotted the snow-capped volcanoes of the mainland interior, and made contact with Aztec-affiliated groups who gave them gold objects and told them about a wealthy empire in the highlands. And if you're wondering why the locals would share this information instead of, say, pretending to be poor and hoping the scary pale people would go away, well, some of them may have been hoping to redirect Spanish attention toward their overlords rather than themselves, which is reasonable self-preservation, but also an early sign of the political fault lines that Cortés would later exploit. The mainstream historical fact grounding this section is that Spanish conquistadors were not soldiers in the modern military sense. They were more like armed entrepreneurs who financed their own expeditions with borrowed money and expected to repay their debts with plunder, which created a desperate economic pressure to keep pushing forward, even when tactical wisdom suggested retreat, because going home empty-handed meant going home to creditors and debtors' prison. You shift forward in time now to early 1519, and the scene is the harbor of Santiago de Cuba, where a fleet of 11 ships is being assembled under the command of Hernán Cortés, a man who is about to become one of history's most controversial figures, and depending on which historian you ask, he's either a military genius and cultural bridge builder, or one of history's greatest villains, and the honest answer is probably yes, all of those simultaneously, because conquest is not a simple phenomenon. Cortés at this point is about 34 years old, which was solidly middle-aged by 16th century standards, and he spent 15 years in the Caribbean working as a farmer, notary, and minor colonial official, amassing enough wealth and connections to organize an expedition, but never quite achieving the glory he craved. The quirky fringe tidbit here is that Cortés almost didn't lead this expedition at all. Governor Velázquez got cold feet at the last minute, tried to revoke Cortés's commission, and Cortés literally sailed out of harbor while Velázquez was still sending messengers to stop him, which means the entire conquest of Mexico was technically unauthorized from the beginning, essentially a mutiny combined with an invasion combined with a startup company, making an extremely aggressive market entry. You're standing on the deck of one of those ships now, feeling it roll beneath your feet, and the smell is incredible in the worst possible way. Bilge water, unwashed men in wool and leather, horses that have been confined in wooden stalls for days, salted meat that's slightly off, and over everything the tar and hemp and salt of a working sailing vessel. And you understand suddenly why sailors of this era were famous for their tolerance of discomfort, because you had to be comfortable with truly appalling conditions just to survive the voyage. The expedition comprises about 600 Spaniards plus several hundred Cuban indigenous allies and enslaved Africans, whose names rarely made it into the historical record, because colonial sources were not generally interested in documenting the contributions of anyone who wasn't Spanish and male and leading something. They have 16 horses, which sounds pathetic until you remember that horses were unknown in the Americas and would prove to be one of the most devastating psychological weapons in the Spanish arsenal. Because imagine you've never seen anything larger than a deer, and suddenly there's a 1,200-pound animal charging at you, carrying a metal-encased human, who seems to be part of the animal itself. They have a few cannons, some crossbows, lots of swords and lances, and several war dogs, mastiffs trained to attack human beings, which is genuinely horrifying and exactly as brutal as it sounds. The journey takes them along the Yucatan coast, and they have various adventures that we won't fully detail because we need to get to the main event. But the important thing is that Cortés is gathering information the whole time, meeting with local leaders, asking about the interior, learning about this empire called Mexico that collects tribute from everyone and is both feared and resented throughout the region. He also picks up 2 individuals who will prove invaluable: Jerónimo de Aguilar, a Spanish priest who had been shipwrecked years earlier and lived among the Maya long enough to learn their language, and more importantly, a woman known to history by her Spanish name Marina, or sometimes Malinche, an indigenous noblewoman who had been enslaved, traded around, and ended up speaking both Mayan and Nahuatl, the Aztec language. With these two working in sequence, Cortés speaks Spanish to Aguilar. Aguilar speaks Mayan to Marina. Marina speaks Nahuatl to the locals. The Spanish have a communication chain that allows them to negotiate, threaten and lie their way across a linguistically complex landscape. Some scholars debate whether Marina should be seen as a traitor to her people, or a survivor making the best of impossible circumstances, and this open scholarly debate reflects broader questions about agency and collaboration under colonialism, because calling her a traitor assumes she owed primary loyalty to the Aztec state that had brutalized and enslaved her, which is not an obvious assumption. You skip forward to April 1519, and the Spanish have landed near what they'll call Veracruz, True Cross, because conquistadors were big on religious naming, and they're setting up a permanent base camp on the coast. And this is the moment when word finally reaches Moctezuma, in the highlands, that something genuinely unprecedented is happening. The distance from the coast to Tenochtitlan is about 200 miles as the crow flies, but the terrain is murderous. You start at sea level in tropical jungle, climb through temperate forests, cross high mountain passes with volcanic peaks on either side, and descend into the Valley of Mexico at 7,000 feet, and yet the Aztec messenger system could cover this distance in about 2 days, using relay runners stationed along the royal roads, which is genuinely impressive logistical infrastructure, and also means Moctezuma was getting nearly real-time updates about the strangers' activities. The first reports must have been baffling: floating houses on the water, carrying men with white faces and strange hair, some with yellow hair and blue eyes like no human anyone had ever seen, wearing metal all over their bodies, wielding thundersticks that killed at a distance, accompanied by giant deer-like creatures that they sat upon and controlled. You can imagine the messengers trying to describe these things with vocabulary that didn't include words for ships or firearms or horses, falling back on metaphor and approximation, and you can imagine Moctezuma trying to make sense of reports that sounded like descriptions of supernatural beings or fever dreams. The critical question, and the one that would shape everything that followed, was how to categorize these strangers. Were they human beings from some distant land, representatives of a foreign state, who should be handled through diplomacy, and if necessary, warfare? Were they divine or semi-divine beings, perhaps avatars of returning gods, whose arrival had been prophesied and who should be approached with religious reverence? Or were they something in between, something the existing categories couldn't quite capture? And if so, what protocols should apply? Later Spanish accounts, and later indigenous accounts written down after the conquest, would emphasize the god interpretation, particularly the idea that Moctezuma believed Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who had departed eastward across the sea and promised to return. This interpretation is extremely convenient for the Spanish, because it makes their conquest seem divinely ordained rather than simply violent and opportunistic. And many modern historians are skeptical about whether Moctezuma actually believed this, or whether it was a post hoc narrative imposed on events to make them make sense. The mainstream view now tends toward the argument that Moctezuma was probably hedging his bets, uncertain about what exactly these strangers were, and therefore treating them with a caution that looked like deference but was actually strategic information gathering, keeping his options open until he understood what he was dealing with. The joke here, if you can find humor in civilizational catastrophe, is that Moctezuma was essentially doing the first contact protocol that science fiction writers would later develop for alien encounters. Don't shoot first, gather data, try to communicate, avoid making irreversible decisions until you understand the situation. And yet he gets mocked by history for being indecisive, when really he was being rational in the face of the completely irrational. You're in Moctezuma's palace now, watching him receive yet another breathless messenger, and the room around you is magnificent. Walls painted with murals of gods and battles, floors covered with woven mats of exceptional quality, incense burning in corners, servants moving silently to refresh the braziers, and Moctezuma himself sitting on a low throne covered with jaguar skins, wearing the understated elegance of true power, because he didn't need to show off. Everyone already knew who he was. The messenger is describing the Spanish camp on the coast, the way they've planted a wooden cross and performed strange rituals, the way they seem both curious and acquisitive, the way they keep asking about gold, always gold, with an obsession that strikes the indigenous observers as unseemly and slightly ridiculous, because gold in Mesoamerican cultures was valued aesthetically but not monetarily. It didn't buy you anything, it just looked pretty, and the Spanish fixation on it seemed to suggest that these strangers, whoever they were, had very peculiar priorities. Moctezuma makes his first major decision. He sends ambassadors to the coast, bearing elaborate gifts, to gather more information and to communicate Aztec magnificence and power. This seems reasonable, right? It's what any ruler would do when confronted with unknown visitors. Send a diplomatic mission. Show them you're wealthy and organized, and not to be trifled with. See what they want and whether you can work out some arrangement. The problem is that Moctezuma sends gold, lots of gold, exquisitely crafted gold objects that represent the finest work of Aztec craftsmen, sent as gifts to impress the strangers with the wealth and sophistication of the empire, and to Cortés, who understands gold as money, as portable wealth, as the thing that will pay off his debts and make him rich and powerful back in Spain. These gifts don't say we are mighty, treat us with respect, they say there is so much more where this came from, and you should definitely come get it. The mainstream historical interpretation is that this gift-giving was a catastrophic miscommunication, each side operating from incompatible assumptions about what the exchange meant, and that Moctezuma's generosity intended to awe, instead inflamed Spanish greed, beyond any possibility of satisfaction. The quirky tidbit here is that among the gifts Moctezuma sent were elaborate featherwork pieces, cloaks and headdresses made from tens of thousands of individual feathers, painstakingly assembled into complex designs, and these were actually far more valuable in Aztec terms than the gold Quetzal feathers were worth more than jade. But the Spanish, having no context for valuing featherwork, essentially ignored these masterpieces while fixating on the shiny metal, which is either ironic or depressing or both. You watch Cortés receive these gifts, and his face is doing the complicated thing that faces do when they're trying to hide extreme greed behind a mask of diplomatic composure, and he's asking the ambassadors questions through his chain of translators. Where does this gold come from? Is there more? How far to your city? What is your ruler like? And the ambassadors are answering politely, because that's their job, and every answer tells Cortés something useful, and every gift confirms that this is worth the risk, that whatever lies in the highlands is worth marching 200 miles through hostile terrain with 600 men against an empire of millions. The open scholarly debate at this juncture concerns Cortés's own motivations and state of mind. Was he supremely confident, a gambler betting everything on a single throw, or was he desperate, trapped between a revoked commission behind him and unknown dangers ahead, committing to invasion because he had no acceptable alternative? The sources suggest elements of both, plus a genuine religious conviction that he was doing God's work in bringing Christianity to the heathens, which is the kind of self-serving piety that allows people to do terrible things while believing themselves righteous. Cortés makes his own dramatic decision at this point. He has his ship scuttled, destroyed, rendered unseaworthy, so that his men cannot retreat even if they want to. Later legend will say he burned the ships, which is more dramatic, but probably not accurate, and either way the effect is the same. The expedition is now committed, forward or death, no middle ground. This is either brilliant leadership, forcing your followers to fight with total commitment because there's no escape route, or it's insane recklessness that traps 600 people in a situation where surrender and negotiation are effectively impossible. You know from the future that it will work, but standing here in the moment, watching sailors knock holes in perfectly good ships while soldiers mutter nervously, you can feel how close this whole venture was to complete disaster at every single step. The coastal peoples the Spanish encounter are already interesting in what they reveal about Aztec power and its limits. The Totonacs, who live near the Spanish camp, are Aztec tributaries who chafe under the burden of tribute, 20 young men and women per year for sacrifice, plus quantities of produce and goods, and they're cautiously welcoming to these strangers who seem to offer a potential counterweight to Aztec domination. Cortés, who is nothing if not politically astute, immediately begins working this angle, positioning himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror, promising the Totonacs that if they ally with him against Mexico, they'll be freed from tribute forever. And the Totonacs are skeptical but intrigued, because decades of resentment make them willing to consider almost any alternative. This pattern exploiting indigenous divisions to build coalitions against the Aztec state will be the template for everything that follows, and it works because the Aztec tributary system, while efficient at extracting wealth, was absolutely terrible at building loyalty. The Aztecs ruled through fear, not affection, and when an alternative to fear appeared, many of their subjects were eager to take the gamble. You drift now toward the highlands, following the route the Spanish will soon take, and the landscape changes around you with startling rapidity. Coastal jungle gives way to pine forests, the air cools and thins, the volcanoes grow larger on the horizon, and you're climbing, always climbing, toward the central plateau where the imperial capital waits. The march will take weeks, and will involve battles, negotiations, betrayals, and one spectacular massacre, but we'll save the details for the next section, because right now what matters is the atmosphere of gathering doom, the sense that two worlds are hurtling toward collision, and neither can stop even if they wanted to. Back in Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma is receiving updated reports, and the news is increasingly alarming. The strangers are not leaving, they're advancing, they're making alliances with tributary peoples. They have weapons that sound like thunder, and kill from impossible distances, and some of the messenger reports describe the psychological effect of Spanish firearms in vivid terms, the terror of facing a noise so loud it hurts your ears, and watching the man next to you fall dead without anyone touching him. Moctezuma tries various strategies, more gifts, attempts at intimidation, suggestions that the coast is unhealthy and the strangers should leave, invitations to come to the capital that are either genuine hospitality or elaborate traps depending on which source you believe. Nothing works, nothing stops the advance, and you can feel Moctezuma's frustration building, the sense that none of his familiar tools are effective against this unprecedented situation. The Spanish, for their part, are experiencing their own kind of dread. They're massively outnumbered, deep in hostile territory, dependent on indigenous allies whose reliability is uncertain, facing an enemy whose capabilities they don't fully understand, and every step forward takes them further from safety. The soldiers, many of them veterans of Caribbean campaigns where victory was relatively easy, are starting to grasp that this is different, that the people here are organized and numerous and not going to simply collapse at the sight of horses and guns. But they're also committed now, their ships destroyed, their only options victory or death, and that desperate clarity focuses the mind wonderfully, or terribly, depending on your perspective. You settle into a quiet spot on the mountainside as evening falls, and the air is cool here, thin but clean, and you can see the sunset painting the volcanic peaks in shades of orange and pink, and there's a terrible beauty to this landscape that will soon be soaked in blood, and you think about all the people on both sides who are just trying to survive, just trying to figure out the right thing to do in a situation none of them created, and you feel the weight of historical tragedy settling over you like a blanket, heavy but somehow comforting in its finality, because the worst part of suspense is uncertainty, and at least you know how this story ends, even if knowing doesn't make it easier. The drums are sounding somewhere in the distance, marking time in the Aztec way, and you let them carry you towards sleep, each beat a step closer to the collision that will reshape continents. And tomorrow you'll walk the path to Tenochtitlan, alongside men who think they're heroes, and an emperor who doesn't know yet that his world is ending. And you'll try to understand, to really understand how it all went so wrong so fast. But for now, just rest. Let the mountain air fill your lungs. Let the stars wheel overhead in patterns. The Aztec astronomers charted with remarkable precision, and know that morning is coming, whether anyone is ready for it or not. You wake to shouting, which is not ideal for a restful sleep narrative, but we're deep in the action now, and things are getting intense, so take a breath, let your body stay heavy and relaxed, even as your mind follows the story, and trust that we'll find our way back to calm before the night is over. The date is somewhere in August or September of 1519, and the Spanish expedition, now augmented by thousands of Totonac allies, is climbing through the mountain passes toward the central plateau, and the shouting you're hearing is a combination of Spanish commands, indigenous war cries, and the general chaos of an army on the move through difficult terrain, because this march is genuinely one of the most remarkable military endeavors in history. 600 Europeans leading or dragging a coalition force through country that none of them know, facing enemies and potential allies whose intentions are unclear, operating on the edge of disaster every single day. The first major obstacle is Tlaxcala, an independent state that has maintained its freedom from Aztec domination through constant warfare and geographical advantage, essentially an island of resistance in a sea of Aztec tributaries, and the Tlaxcalans present Cortés with both his greatest danger and his greatest opportunity. The danger is immediate. The Tlaxcalans don't know if these strangers are friends or enemies, and their default assumption about armed groups crossing their territory is kill them and sort it out later. And for about 2 weeks they do exactly that, launching attacks that push the Spanish expedition to the brink of annihilation. The mainstream historical fact here is that the battles against Tlaxcala were the most serious military engagements the Spanish faced before reaching Tenochtitlan. with Tlaxcalan armies that numbered in the tens of thousands employing sophisticated tactics and very nearly overwhelming the exhausted Europeans through sheer numerical pressure. And Cortés later admitted that these were the most dangerous days of the entire campaign, when defeat and death seemed not just possible but probable. You're standing on a hillside watching one of these battles unfold below you, and it's simultaneously terrifying and confusing, a swirl of feathered warriors and screaming horses and the crack of firearms, and the Tlaxcalans are brave to the point of recklessness, charging Spanish positions again and again despite casualties that would break the morale of less determined fighters. The obsidian-edged clubs they use, called macahuitl, are devastatingly effective at close range, capable of decapitating a horse with a single blow, and the feathered costumes that look decorative to European eyes are actually sophisticated rank indicators and unit identifiers, allowing coordination across a chaotic battlefield. The Spanish survived through a combination of firepower, steel armor, cavalry charges, and the fact that Tlaxcalan military doctrine prioritizes capturing enemies alive for sacrifice rather than killing them outright, which means Tlaxcalan warriors are sometimes pulling punches when they should be going for lethal strikes. After 2 weeks of inconclusive fighting, the Tlaxcalan leadership decides to change strategies and negotiate, partly because the strangers are proving unexpectedly difficult to defeat, and partly because someone we don't know who floats the revolutionary idea that maybe these foreigners could be useful allies against the hated Aztecs. The quirky fringe tidbit here is that Tlaxcala had been at war with the Aztec Empire for generations, essentially fighting for survival against an enemy that surrounded them on all sides, and they had developed a siege mentality that made them both paranoid and intensely proud, viewing their continued independence as proof of divine favor and military excellence. And when they decided to ally with Cortés, they were making a calculated bet that helping the strangers defeat Mexico would be less dangerous than either fighting the strangers indefinitely or letting the strangers bypass them to ally with their Aztec enemies. The negotiations are complex and fascinating, conducted through the same translation chain of Marina and Aguilar, and you can watch the Tlaxcalan lords evaluating Cortés, trying to gauge his intentions and capabilities, asking probing questions about where he comes from and what he wants, and whether his word can be trusted, and Cortés is doing the same thing in reverse, building mental profiles of each leader, identifying the ambitious ones, and the cautious ones, and the ones who might be swayed by personal flattery. The alliance that emerges is genuine, not just a tactical convenience. The Tlaxcalans will remain loyal to the Spanish throughout the conquest and after, and their reward will be special privileges in colonial New Spain, exemptions from tribute that last for generations, but it's also built on a foundation of shared enemies rather than shared values, and both sides are using each other for their own purposes. Some scholars debate whether the Tlaxcalan alliance should be seen as collaboration with colonizers or as a pragmatic survival strategy by a people who faced annihilation anyway. And this open scholarly debate mirrors larger questions about resistance and accommodation under colonial pressure, because judging historical actors requires understanding their options, and the Tlaxcalans' options were genuinely terrible in every direction. You shift forward now, and the combined Spanish-Tlaxcalan force is marching again, larger and more formidable, heading toward the sacred city of Cholula, and this is where the story takes its first genuinely dark turn, the massacre that serves as a preview of horrors to come. Cholula was one of the oldest and holiest cities in Mesoamerica, site of the largest pyramid by volume ever built, larger at the base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, though not as tall, and it was also an Aztec ally, or at least under Aztec influence, and what happened there depends heavily on whose account you believe. The Spanish version goes like this. The Cholulans were plotting an ambush, planning to massacre the Spanish in the city streets, and Cortés learned of the plot through Marina, who was warned by a local noblewoman, and he preempted the attack by striking first, killing several thousand Cholulans in a few hours of concentrated violence before the trap could be sprung. The indigenous version varies. Some accounts support the conspiracy theory, others suggest the Spanish invented or exaggerated the plot as an excuse for plunder and terror, and the truth is probably lost forever in the confusion of competing narratives and centuries of revision. What's undeniable is the result: thousands dead, a sacred city partially destroyed, and a message sent throughout the region that these strangers were capable of extreme violence and would not hesitate to use it. The mainstream historical fact is that the Cholula massacre served strategic purposes beyond simple punishment. It demonstrated Spanish lethality to wavering indigenous groups. It eliminated a potential enemy stronghold on the road to Tenochtitlan, and it may have been intended to reach Moctezuma as a warning about what resistance would cost, but it also reveals the brutal calculus of conquest, the willingness to commit atrocities in pursuit of strategic goals that would characterize Spanish behavior throughout the campaign. You're standing in the aftermath now, and we won't describe the details because this is supposed to help you sleep, and graphic violence is counterproductive, but you can feel the atmosphere of the place, the smoke and silence, the stunned survivors, the Spanish soldiers methodically looting temples while priests watch their sacred objects carted away, and you understand that whatever illusions of peaceful contact might have existed before, they're gone now, replaced by the naked reality of conquest. The joke here, and yes, I'm going to find dark humor, because it's the only way to survive stories like this, is that the Spanish claim to be bringing Christianity, a religion whose founder preached loving your enemies and turning the other cheek, and their method of introduction was indiscriminate slaughter, which suggests either that they hadn't read the relevant texts, or that they were operating from a very selective interpretation. You leave Cholula behind and continue toward the Valley of Mexico, and the landscape opens up before you in a way that must have seemed almost miraculous to men who had been climbing through forests and narrow passes for weeks. The vast plateau stretching to distant mountains, the lake system glittering in the center, and there, rising from the water like something from a fever dream, the towers and temples of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish soldiers, according to Bernal Diaz's memoir, genuinely couldn't believe what they were seeing, comparing it to enchanted visions and wondering aloud if they were dreaming, because nothing in their European experience had prepared them for a city of this scale and sophistication, and the fact that it was built on water, connected to the mainland by causeways that seemed to float on the surface, only added to the sense of unreality. Meanwhile, in that city, Moctezuma was receiving minute-by-minute updates on the approaching force, and his options were narrowing rapidly. He could fight, meeting the strangers before they reached the capital and trying to destroy them in the field. But the Cholula massacre had demonstrated their military effectiveness, and the defection of Tlaxcala had deprived him of a potential buffer zone. He could refuse entry, closing the causeways and daring the strangers to storm an island fortress with inadequate forces, but this might just delay the confrontation, while giving the strangers more time to build indigenous alliances and accumulate local knowledge. He could receive them as guests, bringing them into the city where they would be surrounded and vulnerable, essentially trading spatial advantage for the ability to observe them closely and perhaps neutralize them through hospitality or treachery. The choice he made inviting Cortés into Tenochtitlan as an honored guest has been criticized by generations of historians as the fatal mistake, the moment of indecision or miscalculation that doomed the empire. But standing here with the information Moctezuma actually had, it's not obviously wrong. The strangers had proven they couldn't be easily defeated in battle, and refusing to meet them would just postpone the problem while potentially making it worse, and receiving them offered the possibility of understanding what they wanted, and maybe finding a diplomatic solution that preserved Aztec sovereignty. The quirky historical tidbit here is that Moctezuma reportedly consulted his closest advisors extensively during this period, and the advice was divided. Some urged military action, others counseled cautious engagement, and the emperor himself seems to have been genuinely uncertain, caught between his religious role, which required maintaining cosmic order through proper ritual, and his political role, which required protecting the state from threats, and it's possible that no single human being could have reconciled these competing demands in a situation this unprecedented. You're walking one of the causeways now, approaching the city from the south, and the Spanish force is stretched out along the road, armored horsemen in front, infantry in the middle, Tlaxcalan allies bringing up the rear, and the people of Tenochtitlan are lining the causeway to watch. Thousands of faces expressing emotions that range from curiosity to fear, to hostility to genuine wonder, because this is the most extraordinary thing most of them have ever seen. Pale strangers in metal shells riding giant deer into the heart of their world. The date is November 8th, 1519. And this is the moment of first direct contact between Cortés and Moctezuma, one of history's most consequential meetings, and the sources describe it in elaborate detail that we should treat with some skepticism, because they were all written years later by people with agendas. The traditional account has Moctezuma being carried on an elaborate litter, dressed in magnificent regalia, meeting Cortés at the entrance to the city, and the two leaders exchanging formal greetings through interpreters, with Moctezuma supposedly acknowledging Cortés as a representative of a great lord from across the sea, and inviting him to treat the city as his home. What actually happened in that conversation is impossible to reconstruct with certainty. The Spanish interpreters may have misunderstood or deliberately mistranslated. Moctezuma's ritual speech may have been filled with formulas and metaphors that lost their nuance in translation, and both sides had reasons to spin the encounter in particular ways when recording it later. Some scholars argue that Moctezuma never surrendered or acknowledged Spanish authority, that what happened was elaborate diplomatic courtesy being interpreted through Spanish wishful thinking, and others argue that he genuinely believed he was dealing with divine or semi-divine beings whose demands had to be accommodated. The open scholarly debate on this point is fierce and probably unresolvable, but the practical effect was that Cortés and his men entered Tenochtitlan as guests, were housed in the palace of Moctezuma's father, and for several days existed in a strange limbo, honored visitors or prisoners in waiting, welcomed guests or invaders being watched until the moment was right to destroy them. You're inside the city now, walking through streets crowded with more people than most European capitals contained, past markets selling goods from across Mesoamerica, past temples where priests conducted rituals that the Spanish found both fascinating and horrifying, past gardens and aviaries, and the famous zoo with its collection of exotic animals. And the sensory overload is genuine, impossible to process all at once, a civilization in full flower that the Spanish are simultaneously admiring and planning to destroy. The first few days are filled with tourism, essentially Cortés and his captains being shown around the city, visiting the great temple and the markets and the palace complex, asking endless questions about how everything works, and Moctezuma being an unexpectedly gracious host, sharing meals and conversation, trying to understand what these people want, and whether there's any way to get them to leave peacefully. The tension underneath the hospitality is palpable, though both sides know this is temporary, that some kind of resolution is inevitable, and the Spanish in particular are conscious of how vulnerable they are. A few hundred men surrounded by a city of hundreds of thousands who could overwhelm them through sheer numbers if they chose to fight. Cortés makes his move about a week after arrival, and it's one of the most audacious acts of the entire conquest. He essentially takes Moctezuma hostage, manufacturing a pretext. Some Spanish soldiers had been killed in a skirmish on the coast, supposedly by Aztec forces, and demanding that the emperor come stay in the Spanish quarters as a guest to demonstrate that he had nothing to do with the violence. Moctezuma initially refuses, then agrees, and historians have argued about why ever since. Was he coerced by implicit threats? Did he believe cooperation was still the best strategy? Was he already mentally defeated by the strangeness of the situation? We don't know, and we can't know, because we can't get inside his head, and all our sources are filtered through Spanish interests and retrospective rationalization. What we know is that from this point forward, Moctezuma was effectively a prisoner in his own city, still officially the ruler, still going through the motions of governance, but always under Spanish supervision, his authority visibly compromised, his divine status tarnished by his evident subjection to foreigners. The mainstream historical interpretation is that this was the true point of no return, the moment when recovery became almost impossible, not the initial reception of the Spanish, not even the invitation into the city, but the humiliation of the emperor in front of his own people, which shattered the mystique of Aztec power, and emboldened both indigenous allies and subject peoples to imagine a world without Aztec domination. The weeks that follow are strange and increasingly tense, a kind of slow-motion hostage crisis, where everyone knows the situation is unsustainable, but no one quite knows how to resolve it. Moctezuma continues to rule in nominal terms, issuing orders and receiving tribute, but he does so under Spanish eyes, and the Aztec nobility is growing restless, whispering about the emperor's weakness, and wondering whether someone more decisive should take command. Cortés, for his part, is trying to consolidate his position, sending expeditions to secure the coast, demanding more gold, smashing religious idols, and setting up Christian altars in the temples, each act escalating the underlying tension, while he pretends nothing is wrong. The comedy here, dark as it is, lies in the sheer preposterousness of the situation. A few hundred soldiers holding an empire hostage through the person of its ruler, maintaining the fiction of diplomatic normalcy, while everyone can see that nothing is normal, conducting governance through increasingly transparent force, while claiming to be honored guests. You find a quiet corner in the palace complex as night falls, and the sounds of the city drift through the windows, people talking, children playing, dogs barking, the eternal drums marking time, and you think about how life goes on, even in impossible situations, how ordinary people still need to eat and sleep, and raise their families, even when their world is falling apart around them. and there's something both comforting and devastating about that continuity, the way human life refuses to stop even when history is pivoting toward catastrophe. You let the sounds carry you towards sleep now, because the next section is going to be violent, and we should rest before we face it, and you try to hold on to this moment of strange peace in the middle of chaos, this last breath before the storm breaks, and you know that morning is coming, and with it the beginning of the end. But for now, just let the drums fade into the background, let your breath slow, let your eyes close, and know that even emperors and conquistadors eventually had to sleep, that even in November 1519, there were quiet moments between the dramatic ones, and you can rest in those quiet moments, let them hold you, let them carry you through the night, until we're ready to continue. You open your eyes to a room that smells like copal incense and Spanish sweat, a combination that shouldn't exist but increasingly defines this strange chapter of history, and the date has advanced to spring of 1520, and the situation in Tenochtitlan has deteriorated from tense to actively dangerous in ways that are becoming harder to ignore. Moctezuma has been a prisoner for months now, his authority eroding daily, his people growing more restless as they watch their god-king take orders from foreigners, and the Spanish are trapped in a problem they created. They hold the emperor, but can't leave the city with him, can't release him without losing their leverage, and can't stay indefinitely as unwelcome guests in a population that increasingly wants them dead. You're standing in the courtyard of the palace where the Spanish are quartered, watching soldiers go through their morning routines, sharpening swords, checking armor, practicing maneuvers, and the atmosphere is one of barely contained anxiety. Men who know they're surrounded by enemies, maintaining discipline, because discipline is the only thing keeping them alive. The mainstream historical fact grounding this section is that the Spanish occupation of Tenochtitlan lasted approximately 6 months, from November 1519 to June 1520, a period during which the situation gradually but steadily worsened, as both sides realized that the strange arrangement of honored guests holding the emperor hostage was not sustainable. Cortés, whatever his faults, was politically astute enough to recognize the instability, but he was also trapped by his own success. Having captured an empire's ruler through audacity, he couldn't figure out how to convert that leverage into lasting control, and every day that passed gave the Aztecs more time to organize resistance while eroding the Spanish pretense of friendly visitation. The first major crisis arrives from an unexpected direction, the coast, where Governor Velázquez of Cuba has sent a new expedition under Panfilo de Narváez, with orders to arrest Cortés and bring him back in chains. This is technically a legal matter. Cortés left Cuba without authorization and has been conducting an unauthorized conquest, but it throws everything into chaos because now Cortés has to deal with Spanish enemies as well as Aztec ones, and the timing could not be worse. The quirky fringe tidbit here is that Narváez brought about 900 soldiers to arrest Cortés, nearly twice the size of Cortés's original expedition, which tells you something about how seriously Velázquez took the threat of being cut out of the Mexico profits. And the fact that these 900 soldiers ended up joining Cortés rather than arresting him tells you something about the conquistador's extraordinary ability to win people over through a combination of promised wealth and personal charisma. Cortés makes the risky decision to leave Tenochtitlan and march back to the coast to deal with Narváez personally, taking a portion of his force and leaving the rest under the command of Pedro de Alvarado, a hot-headed lieutenant who will prove spectacularly ill-suited to the delicate situation. You stay in Tenochtitlan as Cortés departs, watching the balance of power shift subtly but unmistakably. The Aztec nobility, who have been seething under foreign occupation, sense weakness in the reduced Spanish garrison, and preparations begin for something, though exactly what is hard to determine from your observer's position. The timing is significant. The festival of Toxcatl is approaching, one of the most important religious celebrations in the Aztec calendar, honoring the god Tezcatlipoca through elaborate dances and ceremonies in the sacred precinct, and Alvarado has given permission for the festival to proceed, though with the stipulation that the performers go unarmed. What happens next is disputed, one of those historical events where the sources disagree so fundamentally that the truth may be unrecoverable. The Spanish version. Alvarado learned of a conspiracy to attack the Spanish during the festival, using the gathering as cover for a coordinated assault, and he preemptively struck to prevent the ambush, killing the conspirators before they could act. The indigenous version. The Spanish, motivated by greed for the gold ornaments the dancers were wearing, or by religious horror at the demonic ceremonies, or simply by bloodlust, attacked unarmed celebrants without provocation, massacring hundreds of the Aztec elite in what amounted to a war crime. The mainstream historical interpretation tends toward the latter view. Most modern historians believe the Tenochtitlan massacre was unprovoked aggression, probably motivated by multiple factors including greed, fear, and genuine cultural revulsion. But we should acknowledge that certainty is impossible, and that some scholars debate whether Alvarado had genuine intelligence about a planned uprising. What's undeniable is the result. The sacred precinct ran with blood. The flower of Aztec nobility lay dead in their ceremonial regalia, and whatever ambiguity had existed about Spanish intentions was now resolved into pure, crystalline hatred. You're standing outside the temple complex as the massacre ends, and the sound that fills the city is something between a wail and a roar, the collective voice of a people who have just witnessed the desecration of their most sacred space and the murder of their most honored citizens. And within hours, the entire city has risen against the Spanish, the streets filling with warriors, the causeways being cut, the palace where the garrison is trapped coming under siege from every direction. The next few days are a nightmare for the Spanish, trapped in their compound, surrounded by enemies who attack in waves, running low on food and water, taking casualties they can't afford, and their only bargaining chip, Moctezuma, has become almost useless because his people no longer listen to him, no longer respect his authority, no longer believe he speaks for anyone but the foreigners who hold him captive. Some scholars debate whether Moctezuma was complicit in the Spanish occupation to some degree, collaborating with Cortés to maintain his personal power, even at the cost of his people's freedom, and this open scholarly debate reflects the genuine complexity of his position, a man caught between impossible options, trying to navigate a situation that had no good outcomes, failing in ways that may have been inevitable, regardless of what he chose. The joke here, if gallows humor counts, is that Moctezuma's captivity had been so comfortable, he still had his servants, his wives, his daily routines, that some historians wonder if he ever fully grasped how much danger he was in, which is a bit like a frog in slowly heating water, not noticing the temperature until it's too late, except the water is an entire civilization collapsing. Cortés, meanwhile, has dealt with Narvaez, defeated him in a night attack, recruited most of his soldiers with promises of Aztec gold, and now is marching back to Tenochtitlan with a significantly larger force, over 1,000 Spaniards plus indigenous allies, expecting to resume his position of comfortable dominance and finding instead a city at war. The date is approximately June 24th, 1520, and Cortés enters a Tenochtitlan. Transformed, the streets that had been filled with curious onlookers are now empty, or filled with hostile warriors. The markets are closed, the atmosphere is one of siege rather than hospitality, and the Spanish reinforcements barely make it to the palace compound before the attacks resume with renewed intensity. The situation is now genuinely desperate. The Spanish have more soldiers, but they're also consuming more food and water, and the Aztecs are not letting anything through, starving them out while maintaining constant pressure through projectiles and probing attacks. Moctezuma's final scene approaches, and it's one of the most debated moments in the entire conquest narrative. The Spanish version, Cortés convinced Moctezuma to address his people from the palace roof, hoping his authority would calm the uprising, but the Aztec crowd rejected their emperor, pelting him with stones, and Moctezuma died from his injuries a few days later, a broken man abandoned by his own subjects. The indigenous version varies. Some accounts agree with the basic outline, but suggest Moctezuma was already mortally wounded by Spanish hands before appearing on the roof. Others claim he was strangled by the Spanish once he became useless, and still others maintain he survived longer than Spanish sources suggest, and was killed during the retreat that followed. The mainstream historical interpretation is uncertain. Moctezuma probably did die around this time, probably in circumstances that reflected his impossible position, but the exact details are lost in the fog of crisis and competing narratives. What's clear is that his death, however it occurred, removed the last pretense of legitimate authority from the Spanish position. They were now unambiguously invaders, occupiers, enemies to be expelled rather than guests who had overstayed their welcome. You watch from a high window as the chaos unfolds below, Aztec warriors swarming through the streets, Spanish soldiers making desperate sorties to secure water or clear firing positions, the constant noise of combat mixed with the screams of the wounded and the war cries of attackers who know they have the upper hand for the first time since the strangers arrived. The palace complex is becoming a death trap, and everyone knows it. The food is running out, the water is scarce, the wounded are piling up, and every day the Aztec pressure increases as more warriors arrive from the mainland, and the organization of the defense improves. Cortés calls a council of his captains, and the decision is unanimous. They have to break out or die where they stand, and the breakout has to happen at night, when darkness might give them some advantage, and it has to happen soon, before they're too weak to fight their way through. The plan is straightforward in conception, and nearly impossible in execution. March out along the causeway to Tlacopan, the shortest route to the mainland, fighting through whatever resistance they encounter, hoping to reach open ground, where cavalry and firearms can give them advantage over enemies who will be crowded onto narrow causeways, and vulnerable to concentrated fire. The quirky historical tidbit is that Cortés ordered a portable bridge constructed to span the gaps in the causeway where the Aztecs had removed the wooden sections, because without bridges they would be trapped at each gap, unable to advance or retreat, sitting targets for warriors in canoes. And this bridge, carried by a designated unit of soldiers, becomes a critical element of the escape attempt, though it will ultimately prove inadequate to the task. You prepare to leave with the army, and the atmosphere is one of controlled terror, soldiers loading themselves with as much gold as they can carry, which will prove to be a fatal mistake for many, officers trying to maintain discipline, while knowing that once they leave the compound, everything depends on speed and luck, indigenous allies wondering if they've made a horrible mistake, and whether the Aztecs will show mercy to turncoats. The night of June 30th, 1520, is rainy, which the Spanish consider good luck because it might reduce visibility and dampen the alertness of Aztec sentries, and sometime after midnight, the column begins to move, slipping out of the compound in as much silence as several thousand armored soldiers can manage, which is not much silence at all. The first few minutes are deceptively encouraging. They reach the causeway without encountering resistance. The portable bridge spans the first gap successfully, and hope flickers that maybe, just maybe, the Aztecs have been caught sleeping and the escape will succeed. Then the alarm sounds. The noise that follows is hard to describe. Horns and drums, and human voices raised in a cry that seems to come from everywhere at once. The city itself screaming warning, and within seconds the causeway is under attack from every direction. Warriors pouring onto the road ahead and behind, canoes filling the water on both sides, arrows and darts and stones falling like deadly rain, and the orderly retreat becomes a desperate scramble for survival. The portable bridge gets stuck at the second gap, wedged into the causeway so tightly it can't be moved, and suddenly the Spanish column is fragmenting, each gap in the causeway becoming a bottleneck where men pile up and die, while others abandon equipment and plunge into the water and drown under the weight of their armor and their stolen gold. You're somewhere in the middle of this chaos, and the sounds are overwhelming. The clash of weapons, the splash of bodies hitting water, the screams of men and horses, the triumphant cries of Aztec warriors pulling enemies from the column and dragging them toward canoes for capture and later sacrifice. And the darkness makes everything worse, impossible to tell friend from enemy, impossible to know which direction leads to safety, impossible to do anything but push forward and hope. The mainstream historical fact is that the Spanish lost somewhere between 600 and 1,000 soldiers during this retreat. Estimates vary widely because record-keeping was not a priority while running for your life, plus most of their horses, all their artillery, nearly all the gold they had accumulated, and many of their indigenous allies, making it one of the most catastrophic military defeats in Spanish colonial history. The Aztecs would remember it as a great victory. The Spanish would call it La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, and according to legend, Cortés sat under a tree on the mainland the next morning and wept for his fallen soldiers. Though whether this actually happened or was embroidered later is anyone's guess. You stumble off the causeway as dawn breaks, somehow still alive, and the survivors are gathering in exhausted clusters, treating wounds, counting who's missing, trying to comprehend how completely the situation has reversed. Yesterday they held an emperor hostage in his own capital. Today they're refugees fleeing for their lives through hostile territory. The Aztecs don't pursue aggressively, a decision that historians have questioned, though the reasons might have been practical. Organizing a pursuit takes time, and the priority was securing the city and dealing with internal matters, like choosing a new emperor, or might have been related to the fact that many captured Spanish soldiers were being prepared for sacrifice, which was more important than chasing survivors who might die in the countryside anyway. You rest for a moment, letting your body process the trauma of the night, and the story could end here, should end here, from the Aztec perspective, with the invaders expelled, their army shattered, their leader humiliated, the natural order restored. But of course you know it doesn't end here, that something happened in the months that followed, that transformed Spanish defeat into Aztec annihilation, and that something is simultaneously invisible and unstoppable, already spreading through the city, even as the warriors celebrate their victory. Sleep comes hard after violence, but it comes, and you let yourself drift now. Let the sound of your own breathing replace the echoes of screaming. Let the darkness become peaceful instead of terrifying, and know that the worst is yet to come, but also that you don't have to face it tonight. Not yet, just rest now. Let your shoulders release, let your jaw unclench, and know that even in the midst of catastrophe, there are pauses, moments of quiet between the storms, and you're in one of those moments now. Safe for the moment, breathing slowly, letting the story hold you without demanding anything more tonight. You wake to a different kind of silence, and the calendar has advanced to summer of 1521, more than a year since the Night of Sorrows, and the silence you're hearing is not peaceful but ominous. The silence of a city under siege, a city dying, a city where the cries of the sick and starving have faded because there aren't enough strong voices left to cry. Tenochtitlan is surrounded, the causeways controlled by Spanish and Allied forces, the lake patrolled by brigantines that Cortés had built specifically for this campaign. Each gap in the Aztec defenses slowly widened over months of grinding attrition, and what you're witnessing is the final act of a tragedy that began with a handshake and ended with annihilation. The mainstream historical fact anchoring our conclusion is this: the siege of Tenochtitlan lasted approximately 3 months, from May to August 1521, and by the time it ended, the city that had dazzled Spanish soldiers with its beauty and sophistication was a ruin, its population reduced by perhaps 90%, through a combination of combat, starvation and disease, and the Aztec Empire that had dominated central Mexico for nearly a century had simply ceased to exist. The story of how the Spanish recovered from their catastrophic defeat requires understanding 2 factors: Cortés's relentless determination and the invisible ally that the Spanish brought with them without knowing it. After the Night of Sorrows, Cortés led his shattered force on a desperate march through hostile territory, fighting a major battle at Otumba, where Aztec forces nearly finished what the retreat had started, but surviving, barely, reaching Tlaxcala, where his allies remained loyal despite every reason to abandon him, and beginning almost immediately to plan the reconquest. The Tlaxcalans' continued alliance is one of the might-have-been moments of history. If they had turned against the weakened Spanish, the conquest would probably have ended right there. Cortés and his survivors killed or captured, the Spanish presence in Mexico erased, but they didn't turn, whether because they hated the Aztecs too much or trusted Cortés too much or simply couldn't imagine that the strangers might actually lose, and their support gave Cortés the base he needed to rebuild. Over the following months, Spanish reinforcements arrived at the coast, soldiers coming from Cuba and the Caribbean, drawn by rumors of gold and glory, and Cortés assembled a new army, larger than before, better equipped, and now supported by a sophisticated siege train, including the brigantines that would control the lake and cut Tenochtitlan off from resupply. But the real killer was already at work, invisible and unstoppable. The quirky fringe tidbit, though quirky seems wrong for something so devastating, is that one of the soldiers in Narvaez's expedition, the one Cortés had defeated and absorbed, was carrying smallpox, a disease unknown in the Americas, against which indigenous populations had no immunity whatsoever. The epidemic that swept through central Mexico in late 1520 killed uncountable numbers. Modern estimates range from millions to tens of millions across the hemisphere over subsequent decades, and it struck the Aztec leadership at exactly the worst moment, killing Cuitlahuac, the new emperor who had led the successful defense against the Spanish after only 80 days in power. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, was young and brave and would lead the final defense of Tenochtitlan with remarkable courage, but he inherited a people already devastated by a disease they had never seen before and couldn't understand, their traditional medicine useless, their priests' rituals ineffective, their faith in divine protection shattered by evidence that the gods had either abandoned them or never had the power they claimed. Some scholars debate the relative importance of disease versus military factors in the Spanish conquest, and this open scholarly debate matters because it affects how we understand agency and responsibility. If disease was the primary killer, then the conquest was more accident than achievement, a catastrophe of epidemiology, rather than a triumph of European arms. But the honest answer is probably that both factors were essential, that neither alone would have succeeded, and that the combination produced a result neither side could have predicted or controlled. You're walking through the outskirts of Tenochtitlan now, and the signs of siege are everywhere. Buildings damaged by combat or dismantled for defensive materials, gardens overgrown and untended, canals choked with debris, and the people you pass have the hollow-eyed look of the starving, the sick, the grieving. The Spanish strategy has been methodical and merciless. Advance section by section, demolish buildings to prevent ambushes, fill in canals to give cavalry room to maneuver, maintain constant pressure while the blockade slowly strangles the city's supplies. The Aztec defense has been equally determined, every street contested, every building fought for, warriors attacking from rooftops and from canoes, and in desperate hand-to-hand combat that negates Spanish technological advantages, but determination alone cannot overcome the mathematics of siege warfare when your enemy controls the water and no reinforcements are coming. The mainstream historical interpretation is that Cuauhtémoc and his advisors knew they were losing, knew the situation was hopeless, but chose to fight anyway, partly from genuine conviction that surrender would be worse than death, and partly because the Aztec cultural framework had no good category for surrender, no mechanism for admitting defeat that would allow leaders to survive with honor. The joke here, darkest of all, is that the Spanish also had no good mechanism for accepting surrender. Their goal was total conquest, not negotiated settlement, and even if Cuauhtémoc had tried to negotiate, the terms Cortés would have offered would have been indistinguishable from unconditional submission. The final days are almost unbearable to contemplate. The last defenders crowded into the northern districts of the city, eating leather and roots and each other, drinking brackish water contaminated by corpses, dying of disease as fast as they died in combat, and still fighting, still refusing to give up, still believing or pretending to believe that some miracle might save them. Cuauhtémoc is captured on August 13, 1521, pulled from a canoe while trying to flee the city, and his surrender marks the official end of the Aztec Empire, though empire seems like a strange word for what remains. A few smoking neighborhoods, a handful of survivors, a vast silence where a great civilization once stood. You stand in the ruins of the Templo Mayor, and the twin temples at the top are gone, demolished by Spanish soldiers who saw them as monuments to demonic worship, and the great plaza, that once held markets and ceremonies, and the beating heart of an empire, is filled with rubble and corpses, and the exhausted survivors who don't know yet what their future holds, only that their past is gone forever. The Spanish will rebuild on this site, using Aztec stonework for their colonial buildings, constructing a cathedral where the temples stood, naming the new city Mexico City after the empire they destroyed, and the indigenous population that survives will be baptized, enslaved, used for labor in mines and farms, their languages suppressed, their religions forbidden, their history rewritten by the victors. Cortés will become fabulously wealthy and profoundly unhappy, spending the rest of his life fighting legal battles and seeking recognition he never quite receives, dying in Spain in 1547 with the ironic fate of having conquered an empire, but never achieving the noble title he craved. Cuauhtémoc will be held prisoner for years, tortured for information about hidden gold, and eventually executed in 1525 during a confused and possibly unjustified episode on an expedition to Honduras, the last emperor of the Aztecs dying in a jungle far from his ruined capital. The mainstream historical fact for our conclusion is that the conquest of Mexico was not simply a military event, but the beginning of a demographic catastrophe that would kill somewhere between 70 and 90% of the indigenous population of central Mexico over the following century, through disease, exploitation, and the destruction of the economic and social systems that had supported millions of lives. What remained was a colonial society built on indigenous suffering, a hierarchy that placed Spanish-born peninsulares at the top, followed by American-born Creoles, mixed-race mestizos, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans at the bottom, a system that would endure for 3 centuries and whose echoes persist in Mexican society today. The quirky historical tidbit for our ending is that Moctezuma's descendants intermarried with Spanish nobility, and some of their lines survived into the colonial and even modern eras, occasionally surfacing in news stories about people who can claim descent from the last independent Aztec ruler, which is either ironic or hopeful, depending on how you look at it. The bloodline that couldn't save the empire, enduring long after the empire itself became a memory. You leave the ruined city now, walking into the highlands that will slowly refill with people and life, and the silence follows you, that particular silence of aftermath, of catastrophe so complete that even the morning has exhausted itself, The story we've told tonight is not a comfortable one, and I haven't tried to make it comfortable, because some things shouldn't be comfortable, some tragedies shouldn't be softened, and understanding history means facing the worst of what humans have done to each other without looking away. But I want to end with something that's not quite hope, but might be its distant cousin. The recognition that even catastrophe doesn't erase everything, that cultures survive in fragments and memories and the blood of descendants, that the Nahuatl language is still spoken by millions of people, that Aztec art and architecture and concepts have influenced Mexican identity in ways that persist 5 centuries later, that the story didn't end in 1521, but continued in different forms, changed but not erased. The fatal mistake of the title, was it Moctezuma's hesitation, his gifts of gold, his decision to receive the Spanish as guests, his willingness to become their prisoner? The question almost answers itself by being unanswerable. In a situation this unprecedented, with information this incomplete, and stakes this high, any decision might have been wrong, and the only certain thing is that the world that existed before November 1519 could never have survived the contact that began that day. The Spanish brought diseases that would have spread regardless of diplomacy, weapons that would have found targets regardless of welcome, and a cultural imperialism that could not coexist with Aztec sovereignty, regardless of what any individual chose. The mistakes were real, but they may not have mattered. The catastrophe was coming regardless, built into the biological and technological gaps between continents, and Moctezuma and Cortés, and everyone else were just actors in a tragedy, whose script had been written by centuries of separate development on opposite sides of an ocean. Let your eyes close now if they haven't already, and let your breathing slow, and know that sleep is the oldest refuge, the place where consciousness rests from the weight of history, and you've carried that weight tonight, walked through blood and fire and silence, and you deserve rest now, deserve the quiet that follows storm. The drums have stopped, the sacrifices have ended, the empire sleeps beneath a colonial city that will itself become history, and somewhere in the darkness between waking and dreams, there's a space where the dead rest, and the living prepare for morning, and you can rest there too, suspended between one breath and the next, between one heartbeat and the silence after. Let the weight leave your shoulders now, let your jaw unclench, let your hands unfold. The story is over, the tragedy complete, and what remains is the gentle dark, the soft hum of the fan you turned on at the beginning, the knowledge that you survived the telling as humans always survive the telling, carrying the past forward in memory and meaning, and the quiet determination to understand. Sleep now, the lake is still, the temples are shadows, the stars are the same stars, the Aztec astronomers charted, turning slowly overhead, marking time in ways that outlast empires. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.